For simple figure piping, you're going to start with a large dot. I'm using a tip number 10. Remember, you want to completely release pressure on the bag before you pull the tip away. For this face, I'm going to come back with a small tip number 3 and add a small dot for the nose, and then add a little bit of a line for the ear on the side of the circle, and then outline that so it's an ear shape. And then I'm going to come back with an even smaller tip, a number 2 or a number 1, and add the features like the eyes and the mouth. And then to make some hair, I'm just going to use the same small round tip, I believe it's a number 2, and I'm going to pull out some lines from the top of the large round circle. Once you've mastered these large dots, you can pretty much turn them into anything you want. Here I'm going to make a kitty cat face. Again, I just use a large round tip number 10 to make the dot, and then I'm going to come along with a tip number 5, and I'm going to pipe an ear shape on the top of the dot on each side, and then I'm going to come back with a smaller tip, maybe a tip number 3, and outline the ear shape so that it looks more like an ear. And then I'm going to come back with a tip number 2 or a tip number 1 and pipe the details like the eyes and the nose and the whiskers. The smaller tip you're able to use, the finer details you'll be able to achieve, but bear in mind that the smaller the tip, the trickier it's going to be to squeeze the icing out of the bottom of it. So for this type of work, you really need to make sure you don't overfill the bag, especially if you're going to be using a tip number 1 or a tip number 2. Another thing to keep in mind when you're piping the large dot is allow the bottom of the large round tip to stay a little bit buried in the top of the dot so that the icing kind of pillows up around it, and then just be sure to completely release pressure before you pull the tip away so you don't get a peak in the middle of your dot. The other thing I would say is when you're doing these faces, it's important to take your time. You don't want to get in a rush. Just, try to maintain good, steady pressure control, especially when you're working on the details, like the eyes and the mouth and the whiskers. And of course, just because the practice board sheet has a yellow cat, that doesn't mean that that's what you have to do. If you'd rather make a tiger, by all means, get you some orange icing, and it's pretty much the exact same thing. You're going to pipe the large round dot and then use a tip number 5 or maybe even a tip number 3 to make the ears coming off of it, outline the ears, and then just add the details and facial features with some black icing and a small round tip. Next, I'm going to make the bear, and again, you're going to start with a large round dot made with a tip number 10. I'm going to then come back with the tip number 5 and make a smaller dot down towards the bottom of the first dot for his nose, and then I'm going to add the ears up at the top, and because he has round ears, these again are just dots, and then I'm going to come back with my smaller tip and some black icing and do the details. On this third outline for the bear, they've added a couple of little paws for him, and I'm just going to use the same tip, that tip number 5 that I used for the nose and for the ears. I'm going to use that tip to also pipe 2 dots down at the bottom of the circle. They're going to be bigger than the dots that I piped for his ears, but not by a whole lot. And then I'm just going to come back with the black icing and add his eyes and his nose and his mouth, and then on the 2 dots down at the bottom underneath his face, I'm going to add dots for his toes. And that's really all there is to it. You've got a bear now. To make the puppy dog's face, it's the same technique. You're going to start with a large dot using a round tip number 10. Then you're going to come back with the tip number 5 and pipe a smaller dot down towards the bottom for his nose. Use a small round tip number 2 and black icing to make his eyes, nose, and mouth. And then I'm going to use a slightly larger tip, maybe a 3, 4, or a 5, and I'm going to pipe his ears along the sides of his head. If you'd rather have a puppy dog with ears that stand up, you could easily pipe ears that stood up rather than coming down along the side of his face. When I piped the bear before, I used white icing, and that works great if you're wanting to make a polar bear. But if you want a brown bear or a grizzly bear, just simply use some chocolate icing, or you can color some icing brown, whichever works for you. Technique is exactly the same. Large dot using a tip number 10, smaller dot towards the bottom of the face using a tip number 5 for his nose, so these got a little bit of dimension. And then add tip number 3 ears and the paws and all the rest of it. Again, it's super easy once you get the hang of piping these dots, and you just got to think what you want to make and make the appropriate animal with the right kind of details. And that's really all there is to it. There's the brown bear. And just for fun, since I already have my chocolate icing out, I'm going to show you what the puppy dog face would look like if it was piped with brown icing like it is on the practice board sheet instead of the white icing like I used before. Again, same technique, large round dot, smaller dot for the nose so that it has a little bit of a 3D effect and it looks more realistic, and then just come back with the black icing and a smaller tip to do the details. And I don't worry a whole lot if the large round dot for the head and the smaller dot for the nose aren't perfectly smooth, because once I pipe in the details, it's going to cover that up and it's going to look just fine once the eyes and the nose and the mouth are added. And there we have the cute little doggy faces.